Okay. We ready to join? Welcome, Annette. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about relationships and finance, which is, I think, a hot topic for a lot of people, especially young people getting married and all, trying to figure it all out. So before we begin, I want to introduce you to our audience and let people know that if they don't catch all of this or there's something they want to hear later, we will have a playback version on our YouTube page. And also, they are welcome to ask questions in our little question and answer box.
Perfect.
So let me tell you all about Annette, and I'm going to move my paper over a little bit. But so Annette earned her master's in counseling psychology after studying mental health disparities, OCD treatment, and cognitive behavioral therapies. And in 2017, her master's thesis inspired her to found Enriched Couples, a financial wellness company. She spends her days thinking about psychology of money, romantic relationships, and her next snack, which I definitely can connect to. So
big snacker.
And maybe later we'll bug you about what is your next snack, or what's your.
I'll have to be thinking about that.
Yes, definitely the thing you want to be thinking about when you're doing like a webinar.
Yeah, for sure. Right? Always. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and kind of kicking off our mental health summit here. Let's start with just the most basic question, which is, what does that even really mean as far as like financial therapy? Because I think a lot of people think of like maybe an accountant that they might go to, or someone who could give financial advice. But what's financial therapy really mean?
Yeah, that's probably one of the 3 most common questions that we get, Amanda. And we're super excited to be participating today. So thank you for inviting us to be here. Financial therapy is probably something most people in the audience haven't heard of before. It's kind of a new thing altogether. So traditionally, if a couple is thinking about what are we supposed to do with our 401k accounts, or how much should we be setting aside in a rainy day fund, or how much should we spend on a mortgage, you would go to maybe a financial planner or a financial advisor. If you're dealing with restructuring debt, so like a lot of credit card debt, sometimes you would go to a debt counselor or a financial counselor. So we completely appreciate that the language and like what in the world it is that we do is kind of new and possibly confusing. So what a financial therapist does is address all of the things in your financial life through the lens of therapy, basically. So psychotherapy. So I was crazy enough one day 3 years ago to wake up, and say, I want to use my background in counseling psychology to help people really dig below the surface when it comes to their finances. So why do you feel the way you do about debt or savings? So what we see with couples is that usually there's something really sort of strongly rooted in a person's history that makes them feel very strongly about savings or about debt or both. And sometimes partners have different views on those things. And it's not always obvious where those views come from or why they're important to you. So we help couples unpack that. There are other financial therapists who focus on working with individuals as their core focus, but we are, as of today, to the best of our knowledge, the only people in the entire country who focus on working with families and couples in particular. Yeah. Yay.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, and how did you get started? So you said like, you have your history in counseling psychology. So, the normal route would probably be that you would become a therapist or maybe a researcher. Obviously you like numbers. So what brought you to that revelation when you woke up, and you were like, that's what I want to do?
So I had a whole career basically before I came back to grad school. So between undergrad, which I did at Purdue, studied behavioral neuroscience, like very nerdy, serious stuff. Between undergrad and grad school, I actually was in Atlanta for 5 years working in tech sales and consulting. So I worked with really cool companies that sold Google, Salesforce, and Microsoft products. And that really gave me an appreciation for what it means to grow a scalable business. So we think a lot about how do we take what we know and touch as many people's lives as we possibly can with that. And technology is a very obvious part of that solution, right? I grew up on a farm in central Indiana. And so I learned about money in weird ways.
I was going to say, so naturally you're a tech person. We get it.
Yeah, right.
Obviously.
Right. Yeah. So it meant that I learned about money in weird ways, like what was going to happen when Dad was selling crops in the fall, like contracting crops. So I remember sitting at the dinner table and the news would come on, like with the commodities prices, like corn, soybeans, wheat, and my dad would go, shh, I need to know what the commodities prices are for the day. And it's funny because that led to a lot of conversations and curiosity for me about what that meant, how it affected our family income. And so I became really interested in kind of quirky, like unusual financial topics like that from the time I was a teenager. And I learned about how do marketplaces work and what is investing, largely because my father was involved in those things as part of how my family made money. So I always think about, what does that comparable story look like for our clients? How did you learn about money? What are your assumptions about money? Like I thought for the longest time, like, not that everyone was sitting around watching commodities prices at family dinners, right. but like they were talking about money maybe in some form or fashion around the dinner table. And now we know, because the research tells us most American families are not comfortable talking about money. And it's not to say necessarily that mine was. It was just sort of so in your face part of daily life that like literally what was in the field was what it was sort of like that was going to determine if I could buy like new like Adidas gym bag, equipment kind of stuff for volleyball season the next year. So those are kinds of parts of my story that made me very interested in personal finance from a young age. And since then, really the root of the company was my master's thesis in counseling psychology. So we have this very embarrassing picture. I haven't mentioned Michael at all yet. So I have a partner, a co-founder named Michael. He is also a licensed therapist. He's been practicing for about a decade, and his area of expertise is actually pretty expansive, but he trains other therapists and he's just a brilliant clinician. And he and I started this research project together all the way back in 2015. It feels like a lifetime ago, like 2020.
Right. Yeah.
Feels like a lifetime, doesn't it?
It does. Well, and this year's accounted for about 50.
Like 7? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, 50. Yeah. Either way, I agree. Long time.
Yeah.
So, there's this really nerdy picture of us in Chicago at a research conference with this little poster that we called "Fighting About Finances," and it was basically our realization that we have lots of tools in psychotherapy, as you know, as a fellow therapist. We have all these tools that we know work. So imagine having an entire garage full of tools that can, help you renovate your house. But if you don't actually, if those tools never leave the box they sit in the garage, there's not a lot of utility in it, right? So the question I asked myself was, how can we take these tools that we know work and look at this huge problem in society that is harmful to couples' relationships and to their financial health? And how can we basically put A and B together and scale it with C being technology? And that was how the company began.
Yeah. Well, I love that, everybody starts in some kind of way. And, if you start kind of nerdy, that's okay.
I'm totally comfortable with my nerdiness now.
Exactly.
I have tech to thank for that.
Right. Yes, exactly. Well, and when people come, or when people get started on this journey of like financial therapy, what do you think are some of the misconceptions that people bring to this? I think to some degree, like you said, that you're under you're using this term financial therapy,
Mhm.
but a lot of people associate it with, more of sitting down and doing the numbers and maybe like working on a 401k or something with somebody else. They don't necessarily have that person there to help counsel them and their partner
Mhm.
about how to arrange money or how to deal with money or how to feel about money.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
it's just sort of here's a little plan. Why don't you follow this template kind of thing?
Mhm.
So what do you notice are some of the misconceptions that people have when it comes to just sort of coming together as partners and financial, awareness and those like just getting started with that?
If we had all day to talk about this, I could spend all day talking about this for sure.
Right.
Because there's so many different ways to answer that, Amanda. But there's a couple of big ones. So the big one that really has hit us over the head again and again and again,
Mm.
and we've interviewed about 50 couples, basically doing what's called customer discovery, which is like, hey, Amanda and Amanda's partner. Um, Actually, usually we interview individually. So it might be like, hey, Amanda,
Mhm.
we want to ask you all these awkward questions about money and your feelings
Right.
about it and all that stuff. And we get really great sort of like understanding and point of view, all these different individuals who are willing to share all of their awkward secrets and feelings with us. And what we've learned through that process is that people really are so influenced. Again, this is a therapist, so influenced by the society we live in. Excuse me.
Mhm.
Woo! Excuse me. um, so the ways that society around you think about money
Mhm.
really show up in how you think about things, how your family thought about things, and how you also sort of expect you and your romantic partner maybe are
Mhm.
supposed to think or feel about those things. And there's one really, really dominant theme in US culture when it comes to money, and that is that money is one of those things you do not talk about. um, and it's partially just sort of a taboo, just like you're not supposed to talk at parties about religion, or politics. Like, you don't
Mhm.
talk about money at the family dinner table. You don't talk about your salary because it's considered crass. Um, that's a huge theme that we see, that right off the bat is a pretty huge barrier to talking
Mhm.
about things. If you're told your whole life you're not supposed to talk about that, then what happens when you get into a serious relationship and you're picturing your future together and you
Mhm.
start thinking about what do you want together, but you don't have like the tools and the skills or like permission even to talk about something as important as money, that's where challenges start to show up.
Mhm. Well, and I think that leads to that, the question of, I don't know how many people really stop and check in with themselves as far as what is my relationship with money, as far as how I feel emotionally. And I think that's what you're starting to talk about, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
this that we have like these cultural ideas of finances and what it's okay. But then you're also growing up in your own experience. And depending on what that experience is, that's going to probably affect the way you relate to spend, think about money, feel about money in
Yeah.
general. So tell us more about that. Tell us how these feelings and emotions really connect when it comes to money, or what you've seen.
Yeah, yeah. That's probably the thing I love about this problem most. I'm asked all the time, like, well, why money in relationships? Like, why is this the particular like problem that you're interested in? And it's because it's a big problem with important consequences to American families, of
Mhm.
all ages. But it's also layered and messy and kind of, there's a lot to it. So I'm confident that I can spend my whole life working on this problem and still be making
Mhm.
a meaningful difference like 50 years from now, which I find very rewarding. So when it comes to, starting to work with a client, or how we approach this in the app that we've built, which is what we've been working on really over the last years building our platform and our application for this. One of the things we always look at is financial literacy is one piece that actually has sort of an interesting, I don't know that the scientific relationship exactly is established yet about its being a predictor of other things, but we have seen that there's a strong relationship between financial literacy. So are you familiar with how compound interest works? Are you familiar with market, like portfolio diversification? There's actually 3 simple questions that make up this financial literacy quiz that we use. It's like an international standard, and I think it's fascinating. You can measure something so complex with 3 questions, but the science shows us it's accurate and it's accurate basically, which is exciting. So here's a good example. If you don't feel confident that you understand money, you're probably more likely to be ashamed or embarrassed. And therefore, on top of all of the social things we talked about, probably not very excited to talk about it. Or if maybe you don't love how your parents handled their finances, or if maybe you think your parents did a fantastic job with money and you just assume everything in life is going to be exactly like how your parents handled things. Those are things that are sort of like invisible, like shame is not something you see. Those are things that really influence the dynamics of how couples in particular approach this. So shame is a big one. Fear is another big one. Like, I don't want to repeat my parents' mistakes, or I took on all this student loan debt when I was like 19 and I'm afraid of making the same mistakes, or afraid of how am I going to pay this all off? Or sometimes, again, it's the opposite. Things have always been fine for me financially. I assume they're going to continue being fine. But what if you have one of those people that feels like everything's going great, so it's going to be great, and the other person is really, really afraid of how to handle their student loan debt? That is actually the story we always share when we're talking about our company, is basically about our first ever customers, Jack and Diane. Like, she sort of comes from an affluent background and she has a ton of student loan debt because she's an attorney, but she also works for like a big fancy white glove law firm in Manhattan and makes, like $150,000 a year. Her fiance doesn't have an emergency savings account. He just started a job that's paying like $70,000 a year. So he makes half as much as her. He doesn't have as much of a financial like safety net, basically. And so the question is, how are those two going to negotiate and figure out which sort of feeling, if you will, is going to be the baseline of how they make financial decisions? So it's funny because we're sort of told, don't talk about money. It's not polite. But then when you become a couple, the advice that couples get are, well, just communicate about it. How are you supposed to communicate about something you've never communicated about before? And so sometimes we use an example of comparing it to if you think about a healthy sexual relationship. If you had no idea what a healthy sexual relationship looked like or was supposed to look like, you might ask all sorts of questions. If you're just learning about sex and sexual relationships for the first time, you might ask, like, well, where are we supposed to do it? And how often are we supposed to do it? And like, are third parties allowed to be part of this? Like, do we need professional help? Like, what are the rules? And, every couple's sex life is different. There aren't really black and white rules for that either. It's messy. You just have to figure out what your boundaries are, how you trust each other. If you do want or need professional help, it's actually really similar, I think, because of the similarities between sex being so taboo and money being so taboo. The difference is, I think you have a lot of media influences and other things that sort of shape and friendships in some cases, where you might at least learn how to have conversations about sex. But with money, like I don't sit around with my girlfriends talking about how much I earn. I've found, that even with my very progressive friends, it's still a very uncomfortable topic. I was with my fiance for 2 years before I had the courage to ask him how much he made. And this is what I do for a living, so it's hard for me too.
Right. No one is like outside of this.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and what are some of the, you mentioned the couple in, in New York, and like, maybe the Louisville version would be a slightly lower salary, but
yeah. No.
But what do you notice are some of the or what do you think are some of the hardest things or hardest conversations? And maybe that word isn't really the right framing, because I think, as you're saying, like, we can come together, we can communicate about this, and we can find ways to connect. But what do you notice are some of the biggest barriers or difficulties that people might experience when it comes to having these conversations, getting started with these conversations, and maybe even like vastly different viewpoints of money?
Yeah, that comes back, Amanda, to a question you asked earlier, actually. And again, relates to sort of social messaging around this. If you look at something I think a lot about is Eastern, like East Asian culture when it comes to money. Like at weddings and celebrations and New Year, you hear talk about prosperity. That's not really a word that gets used a lot in Western culture, in the US in particular. So sometimes the phrase we see a lot is like money mindset or like money messaging. Those are slightly less like nerdy and scientific like phrases than we tend to use, Michael and I, and to be a fly on the wall when we nerd out.
Yes, I'm sure it's a fun
it might be a bit much even for you, Amanda.
Oh yeah.
But in terms of different viewpoints and what makes these conversations challenging is the other big sort of social piece of this is that not only are we not really socially permitted to talk about it or encouraged, the other piece is that we really are told money is supposed to be non-emotional, all logical. And that means that if you can't even get to the point of discussing it, then most couples are starting from a place of thinking, okay, we shouldn't be emotional at all when we talk about this. This is just about what's in your bank account, how much are your student loans, how much can we afford in our mortgage, as opposed to how do I feel about my student loans, and how safe will I feel if we take on, X amount for our mortgage amount. So thinking about what are really all of the things that can bubble to the surface over time that would cause conflict. And feelings are what cause conflict. We always say budgets don't cause breakups, fights do, because it's not actually how much you have in your bank account in most cases. Now, if we're talking about poverty and extreme hardship, then that becomes a different type of conversation for sure, because you're talking about constantly being in a state of basically trying to survive. And that is a whole other type of really chronic stress that we also hope to help with addressing one day. There are a lot of companies out there really working hard on financial inclusion, like helping people who can't get access to bank accounts so that they can have more financial stability. But as we think about it today, the couples that we're best positioned to help are, by way of example, maybe a 25-year-old couple. So they've been out of college for a couple of years, dating for maybe we'll say 3 or 4 years, and they're about to get engaged or maybe even get married. This is an interesting year for getting married. And what we have seen is that people are still getting engaged. People are still getting married. it looks different, but people are still making that commitment. I think what's really interesting about a couple in 2020, again, coming back to an example, a 25-year-old couple in Louisville that recently got engaged is asking themselves, basically, can the so it's two women, so it's a gay couple. Mm-hmm. One of the partners is asking themselves, can I afford to go back to grad school, knowing I'll probably have to take out a lot more student loans for that? Or should I work for a couple of years and then like maybe be able to have someone like Humana, where she hopes to work, sponsor it? Because Humana has, I think, a pretty good education like compensation program. So thinking about, should we go ahead and get married? Should we wait on that? Should we put the money aside that we would spend on the wedding so that, you know, one of us can use it for grad school? Those are the kinds of like life decisions that you're having to balance. And then if you dig below the surface, the question is, okay, if Samantha, the one that wants to go back to grad school, if she waits, is her partner, Mary, going to be, is she going to feel guilty for making Samantha wait? Or Samantha going to feel like resentful maybe that they're making decisions that, you know, could influence her near-term earning opportunity? So those are the kinds of things that we see a lot that millennial and Gen Z couples in particular are having to figure out. And that's less about how much money do you have in the bank, and it's more about what do you value in life as an individual, as a couple, and how do you make decisions about sort of balancing one another's needs, honoring one another's values, and how do you even get to the point where you've sort of agreed sort of your top maybe values as a couple are, and that's something that we focus on a lot as well. Am I making any sense?
Yeah. As you're talking about it, it makes me think how, you know, as therapists, we talk a lot about, you know, we notice the behavior at the surface and we dive under. We want to know what's underneath that behavior that's really creating it, you know, whether that behavior is being angry or, you know, reactive or, so in that case, you know, as you're talking about that couple, I'm thinking, I can imagine, you know, if your dream is to go back to grad school, or if you view going to grad school as your way to keep moving up, and that brings you the feeling of being valued in your work or in your life, you know, gives you an idea of purpose, then it's going to feel really important to you. And like you said, if you have to put that on hold because financially it doesn't make sense at the moment, or there's hesitation to get into more debt, you're planning a wedding and that's expensive or can be.
Right.
So there can be lots of feelings that come up. And some of the things I was going to ask you, I was going to say, if you could just name a random list of feelings. It's a good question. I know you could go on for days, right?
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying though is there's shame sometimes around money. There's guilt sometimes around money. There might be resentment around money, as well as some of those positive feelings of, you know, like hope and maybe even like a feeling of empowerment,
safety,
confidence, safety. Exactly. So it's complicated. There's a lot. And I love that you mentioned earlier that, you know, we're told not to talk about money. And then once you get married, it's
until you are.
Communicate about money.
Don't do. Yeah.
Right. And you're going, it's like, don't ever ride a bike. Oh, now it's your time to ride a bike. Get on that bike. And you're like, I never learned how to ride a bike.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. I'm going to steal that. Yeah.
So, so that is really tricky. And I want to ask you, so you've been developing this app. How does the app help people solve these problems? Because I think an app is a fabulous way to do this, you know, to be able to kind of like have this device that's going to help you communicate more with your partner and also build insight for yourself, right? On, oh yeah, that's why I got so angry about, you know, that extra pair of shoes they bought or whatever.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So it's kind of like having a financial therapist in your pocket. So like a lot of other sort of behavioral health or mental health driven apps, we really think about this through or from a point of view of how do we help our users and our customers change their behavior in bite by bite sustainable ways. And at our core, that's what therapists do. So Michael has been absolutely instrumental in the methodology development and the design of the app, and really helping us think about what are the bite-sized pieces that we want to help people tackle. So we start, just like in a lot of cases in therapy, by measuring where the couple is when they start. So, and that's both at the individual level and the joint level. So what I mean by that is we're asking both partners, how are you feeling about your relationship? So how happy are you? How healthy is the relationship? What are the things you want to work on? Things that you're happiest and proudest of? And what are the values you would say coming into this process that are most important to you? So really a lot of research on couples therapy shows us that coming back to the things that bind you is very important and strengthening and protective for relationships. So we're constantly directing couples back to, let's remember why you got together in the first place. Let's remember what the good things are that happen day to day, month to month, year to year. And we're also looking at financial literacy, like I mentioned earlier, because sometimes if couples have very different levels of financial literacy, that can also be something that helps us sort of raise a red flag and go, okay, this might be part of why it's really difficult to discuss money, because if one person feels maybe afraid they're going to be talked down to, or that they're going to feel overwhelmed maybe in those conversations, those are things that help us know how to sort of direct and guide our users. So the second piece of what we do is help people actually make those changes. So it's kind of like working with a personal trainer. First you get on the scale, your body fat index, then you have to, go to the appointments, actually start making, that a daily habit of engaging and talking. So the middle part is about that awareness raising process. So have you ever in your life, Amanda, been prompted to think about your feelings about money? Like how you feel about your student loans, for example?
I'd say not terribly often. Not terribly often, no.
Yeah.
Besides being a therapist and constantly doing that stuff for myself, that's how I have those aha moments of, that's why I feel that way.
If only we were all trained as therapists.
That would be great, right?
I'd be happy to be out of a job for that reason, right?
Right, exactly.
So it's helping each partner say, well, where do my feelings about this stuff come from? Like, what is the analogous version of like how I learned about money and like what my assumptions are about it? And then it's helping structure the conversations for partners to sit down together and say, okay, Samantha, here's something interesting I just learned about myself. And then Mary going, that's interesting, like to hear you say that, because I've sort of noticed at Thanksgivings that like you and your mom like sort of have this similar view about money, like that when you guys talk about things, like it looks the same. So helping partners sort of look at, themes and what are things that have been surprising to themselves. So again, research shows that sort of sharing something that you've learned about yourself, being vulnerable and self-disclosing, like, oh, I didn't even know this about myself, can actually be a huge opportunity for bonding in the relationship. So it's helping the couple unpack those experiences in a structured way. So we have different topic modules. So couples can pick and choose the ones that they want to go through. So we have, for example, we have Teamwork 101, which recommend is sort of where everybody starts. And we've got one for student loans and wedding budgets and mortgages and credit scores and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then after going through those modules and sort of having those tough conversations about those specific topics, then you shift into really maintaining habits over time. So on a weekly basis, it's checking in with your partner, kind of like, have you ever heard of the concept of a money date, like sitting down with your partner and talking every week?
It sounds very similar to what I tell my clients to do, which is a marriage meeting.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And what does that involve?
It involves talking about, good times, appreciation for the week. It involves the to-do list. What do we have to get done this week? It involves the difficult things like, we're still working on this problem. And then also planning for good times as far as, like, let's have a date this week. Let's do, so it's kind of a bonding, but also helping people work through, difficulties and problems. And like you said, you got to do this on a regular basis. So it's like a weekly, like a Sunday night, let's sit down and have a drink and chat kind of thing.
Like a State of the Union almost.
Very much. Yes. Yeah. State of the Union, literally, in a sense.
Yeah. So that's an excellent point of comparison, actually, Amanda, because the things that you just described are very much how we think about helping couples on a weekly basis touch base about specifically, are we spending our money on the things that we want to be prioritizing as values in our relationship? Or did we slip a little bit this last week and want to, make a correction? Or do we does it turn out like we don't actually really care if we overspend our budget on, lattes and avocado toast, as we get so much grief for as millennials?
Right.
Or, you go like, we don't really care that we ever spent on that because those are little luxuries. Those are things that matter to us, and we're okay with that. Because that's a perfectly acceptable response too. But then that after you've talked about it, right? So helping couples have sort of like the structured process of discovering what works for them. That's like the other piece of advice that I always hear for couples, like, in addition to don't communicate about money, and then suddenly you're supposed to know how to ride a bike one day and communicate. That the other piece of advice is like, well, you just have to find what works for you. The research shows it can take like a decade to figure that out.
Right.
That's a long time. So if we can help accelerate that process by sort of knowing what the magic questions are and helping compress the conversations that would otherwise organically take maybe years and years and years to get through, that for us is a huge win. So that's how we think about the app in particular and working with our customers through that.
Well, and I like that you say that, because I know a lot of my clients, they'll come in with very vague, like you said, very vague statements of like, well, you just got to keep working on it, or you'll know when you know, or, and,
right.
and, then their questions are, but how will I know when I know? Or,
yeah, right.
How do I get there? What is the process? And it sounds like your app really helps lay that foundation as far as, here's the question to ask, or here are the ideas to think about. Here's the framework with that, so that you're not just kind of out there going, I don't know. So how do we start? Like, what do we do?
Yeah.
Which is actually my next question for you is, so how do you recommend couples even start this conversation? Because I imagine before they can get to even like your app, it might be helpful to know, how do we start that conversation? Like you said, you even waited a little while to kind of have that conversation. But you're talking about people who are, maybe moving in together, or, connecting their finances in some way, getting married, maybe buying their first home. I mean, it's an important conversation to have, right, at that point. So, are there any kind of how-tos, still probably going to be general, but how-tos on how people might want to get started on that?
Yeah, I think the really big thing that I want to point out from what you were just saying is that when I think the time timing of when it makes sense to have this conversation is really worth touching on. What we have seen is that, at least in like dual college educated couples, so like, Samantha and Mary example I was just sharing, those are not the real names.
Right.
But in that example, it's like they're going through potentially two major life changes, and major life changes usually come with major financial decisions. So the grad school thing and the wedding budget thing, I think those are really excellent times to sort of say, okay, we want to stop and reflect on who and where we are as individuals and who and where we are as couples. So I do like the State of the Union analogy, because it is sort of, you think of the State of the Union as being sort of like this like really major milestone kind of moment in an administration, almost like it would be in a relationship. So I think it's really, really helpful in terms of starting a conversation in a couple to sort of stop and say, what major decisions are we making together, maybe this week, this month, this year, where we want to sort of check in with ourselves and one another. So I think it's almost like acknowledging the state of your relationship is a really, really great place to start as a how-to, and how you're feeling about that, where you expect it to go next, and sharing those things vulnerably with your partner. I think that's always the right place to start, whether you're having a baby or, buying a house together, getting engaged, getting married. It's taking stock rather of the relationship and how you're feeling about whatever kind of major milestone you're at or approaching, to dive into that conversation. But really beyond that, every kind of scenario beyond that, our app really is personalized enough to help guide couples through that conversation. So there's not really we designed it intentionally, so there's not a lot of groundwork couples need to do, because the whole point, I think, to my mind, is that who in the world knows what that groundwork is? So I think the only thing you really have to think about is, what is your feeling about the current state of your relationship? I think that's really an ongoing conversation that every couple, I think, can and arguably even should have. Does that answer your question?
I think so. And what I'm hearing you say too is, so the hardest part, I think, for most of us is that vulnerability, stepping into it for a moment, right? To be able to say, hey, can we, we're moving in together. Can we talk about finances, right? Which might feel like a very loaded, big, heavy question. Maybe you're worried that your partner's going to think you spend, in a way that's not compatible with them, and it'll end the relationship, or who knows. But noticing that vulnerability. And then I hear you as you're talking about the app, it's like, but have hope that, you're going to have help. It's not, you've got to do the first part, which is kind of like rip the Band-Aid off, have that conversation, say, hey, let's look into this, or let's download the app, or, let's find a way to talk about that. And there is, even if we're drastically different when it comes to our spending habits, we want to be together. And so there's help and there's hope. And, I can hang with this vulnerability for a little bit, right?
Yeah. I think the whole reason it's scary comes back to that, like, it's taboo and like it's not supposed to be emotional. So I think probably like the biggest piece of advice I would give anyone listening today or in the future is just to know that it is okay to have feelings about money. That is probably the big takeaway for my part, is you just have to know and trust that, like, it's part of it, whether we acknowledge it or not. And you and I have talked about that in the past, I think, a little bit, how, like, sort of what the consequences are of if we don't acknowledge that feelings go with money. if we're not able to be vulnerable. The reason that finances become a source of conflict in couples is because of trying to sort of put our feelings in this black box and pretending they don't exist. That is always a recipe for disaster. So instead of putting them in a box that, we're hoping we can just never open again, really it's easier and healthier from day one to acknowledge, of course, you have feelings about money. We literally need it to survive, right? Money is the most important resource we have in the world for our survival. We need love, we need affection, we need shelter, we need all of those things. But in terms of how our brain and our behavior is wired for survival, people get angry and defensive about it because safety, psychological safety, is very connected with money. So understanding if someone feels literally threatened to not have security and safety, then that could be a source of conflict. So it's not about actually spending, too much on, again, lattes or shoes, whatever. Right. It's about, does my partner perceive that we won't have security? And I'll share a personal story actually about that. So my fiance and I were talking recently. Me being an entrepreneur, my income is less than perfectly stable. And my fiance, by comparison, has been at his job, his company, for 20 years now. He started there right out of high school, so he's been there since he was 18. And he and I were talking about promotion opportunities in his company potentially, and negotiating raises and that sort of thing. And he was kind of sharing with me his concerns about how he needs to approach that carefully in his workplace because of the way that they have a very structured process for handling raises. And I was like, I think you can kind of go off script here and ask for the raise outside of the formal process. And he was like, I value the security I have in my job, and I don't want to push the envelope and risk jeopardizing that security. Me being the risk taker in the relationship, I'm like, I think you should go for it. Go off script. And that was really frustrating for him. Like, I frustrated my fiance by saying, I think you should go outside your comfort zone of wanting and needing security. And I saw very clearly in that conversation how important that is to my fiance. And it's really easy for me to take for granted because we're very opposite in our proclivity for taking risks. And that's actually a very common kind of scenario where there's one or maybe both partners feel like security is the most important thing, as opposed to taking chances and hoping that you'll win big, which is how I tend to think about things. Right. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Because, and I'm glad you actually mentioned the career piece or the job piece, because, obviously that's our source of money. And that I know I have clients who would love to either move up in their job, get a new job, but maybe they need insurance. And so they have to stay within that. And then that causes stress because perhaps they don't feel like they're making enough, or, going back to that idea of purpose, that their job doesn't really match their purpose. Right. So we start to see all the ways that, money isn't necessarily 100% part of that picture, but it's definitely a component. And so it's good to be able, I think, to slow down for yourself, check in with yourself, and understand the connection there, right? Like you were saying, your partner is saying, like, okay, wait, I'm the one who makes this stable income here. Yeah. Maybe he'll be more willing to take risks when you have a really nice, solid base, right? Yeah. Yeah. So being able to understand how that kind of felt maybe a little bit of you're pushing on that security button for him. And so he's reacting naturally. And yeah, so this, I think a lot of this conversation is really about helping people, slow down, build insight, think about ways that you feel about money, you connect with money, bring it back to maybe your own family history, or how that works, so that you can have that and recognize when you're talking to your partner how you feel about money, and then have some insight maybe into how they feel about money, and that'll probably help a lot.
And we use a family genogram exercise, actually. Like, we have a worksheet basically that we've used in the past, and now we're hoping to build into the app itself. But for those of you who maybe are watching and aren't familiar with what a genogram is, it's basically like a family tree kind of exercise. And typically in like a therapeutic setting, a family genogram would be about helping you sort of understand themes and patterns in your like family structure or relationships. So sometimes a therapist will have you like put, okay, here was my grandma and grandpa, and here's my parents. Okay, well, are your parents still married? How long? Are they divorced? And then your sibling relationships, cousins, etc. If there's, a lot of themes that are common across your family, seeing it on a piece of paper can be really, really powerful and eye-opening. What we have people do in that exercise with us is put down not just the relationships and who the family members are, but also what kinds of personality or characteristics did they have with money. So I was talking about my grandma, who was also an entrepreneur, lived on the family farm with my dad's dad. She was a licensed beautician. And so she would wake up in the morning, make breakfast for the whole whole family, hired farm hands. Then the men would go out in the field. She'd do like 3 like beehive updos or like perms, like back in the 60s through the 80s. And then she'd come make lunch for everyone. She'd go back to the salon, which they built in the basement for her. So this woman was just working all day and all night, like for all her life, as far as I could see. And then same thing in the evening, she'd make dinner and then go out in the field. So I grew up hearing my grandma say, you see the kitchen cabinets in here? I saved for those like one permanent set at a time, meaning like from every piece of work that I got paid, I put aside a percentage or whatever. So seeing how she contributed to family income and how much pride she took in contributing is something that influenced my ideas about earning. My mother also was, she's an Avon lady, and she's like a district award-winning sales leader. So grew up like shadowing my mom, going out on sales calls. It was great for like show choir fundraisers in high school, helping me sell like boxed candy and stuff. So again, I look at that all on a piece of paper, and I can see, in particular as a female, who were the women in my life, and how did they feel or talk about money. Same thing with men, my siblings, and seeing that all together really is very, gives you sort of like a bigger picture of, oh, okay, well, I just assume like I'm going to make, I'm going to be an equal earner in the family because it's what women in my family have always done. But I also grew up with a less than stable like family income, because family farm earnings can be very unpredictable. So I think that's part of what influences like wanting to work hard, but also understanding some years are going to be really big winners, and you have to take risks sometimes to see that yield, literally. In other years, it's going to be, so it's a little bit feast or famine in that way. So that's an exercise that we use too to help individuals look at their family history and understand, oh, here are things that are maybe unique to the way that I grew up that influence the ways I think and feel about money that I've never considered before. And having then 2 partners compare and contrast those things can be really, really powerful.
Well, and yours is so clear, right? You're like,
Yeah.
grandma, mom, me. Yeah.
Yep.
That makes so much sense. But you probably, we don't sit down and dissect ourselves often. So having that exercise sounds like a really good opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Wrapping up here real quick, tell us, so how can people find the app or get, is it available to start using yet? Or is it still are you still, working on it?
Yeah, great question. So you can sign up to actually help us finish testing the app, which we're doing for the next 60 days or so at enrichedapp.com. We are also on Facebook, Medium, and Instagram. So we have a lot of great blog content in particular on Medium. You can just search for Enriched Couples. And we would love to have, we always say, like, if you are good at telling people what they're bad at, we would love to have you help us test the app because we're really trying to find like the stuff in there that, doesn't make sense, or like maybe like, the app self-implodes. Hopefully we won't find any of those bugs at this point, but yeah, we would love to have couples help us test it. So if you're engaged, a newlywed, have moved in together recently, had a baby, pretty much any of those major kinds of life transitions, you are perfect for helping us test it. And it is free. So you can, like I said, you can go to enrichedapp.com and sign up. Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. And I'm so excited for the app to come out. It sounds like it's definitely a resource that I'll be passing on to clients. Like, all right, guys, let's do this. You can do this.
Awesome.
So yeah, we're very happy to have had you here. And like I said earlier, if someone who's watching wants to watch again or catch a replay, we will have it on our YouTube channel, and then shortly we'll be adding it to the Sonomind app, which is another app that is more like a therapeutic podcasts and listening. So if you're tired of looking at screens, that's where you can find it.
Yeah, I think we all have our limit for that, don't we?
Exactly. Yes. And after you, we're going to be talking about at 2:00 today. We're going to be talking about sex and the pandemic. So more couples conversations. It's going to be a fun, interesting day. So.
That's such a fun conversation, though. So I'll be tuned in for that for sure. Yeah, thank you for having us. And look forward to hearing from other people in the community. So hope you guys have a great. I hope you guys have a really great summit. Yeah, very excited about Mental Health Louisville, and commend your leadership in helping the community have easier, clearer access to all of the great therapeutic providers locally.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yep. So everybody, if you're looking for the Enriched Couples information and you didn't jot it down, we will also have it on our webpage. You can click on Annette's face and it'll take you right there. So awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye, everybody.
Bye.